You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. For decades, I've covered complicated stories of global violence, from the Troubles in Northern Ireland to the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Herzegovina to political coups in Africa. But in the almost half-century I've been a reporter, there's one intractable conflict that never seems to resolve: the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. For weeks, violence in Israel has supplanted the war in Ukraine in the headlines. And as of the date of this recording, a hospital was bombed in Gaza, killing over 500 people. The Israeli military has denied responsibility for the bombing. It claims the blast was a consequence of a misfired rocket from the other side. It's hard to overstate just how completely the Hamas attack on Israeli territory and the ongoing military response from Israel disrupted the evolving situation in the Middle East, or as Foreign Affairs magazine put it in a recent article, fractured the Arab world. From Egypt, trying to keep the Gaza crisis from spilling over into its own territory, to Lebanon, vulnerable to retaliation if Hezbollah joins the widening violence, to Saudi Arabia, in ongoing talks to lower the temperature in its long-standing conflicts with Iran and negotiate some sort of new relationship with Israel, to Washington, hoping to keep Iran from going nuclear and trying to re-enter the agreement hammered out during the Obama years and dropped by Trump. And finally, to Israel, in shock from the initial loss of life, threatening massive retaliation, and under pressure not to release the full potential of its military might on Gaza. Trita Parsi joins me now. He's the author of Losing an Enemy: Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, the behind-the-scenes story of the nuclear deal with Iran. He's a co-founder and former president of the National Iranian-American Council. Welcome back to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Trita, anyone trying to track the situation in Israel and Gaza would be challenged by the vastly different opinions on the causes of the violence and the current state of play. How would you explain it?
I think what we're seeing, unfortunately, was not inevitable in the sense of the specific attack, the specific horrors of the attack, but inevitable in the sense that if we continued on this path in which we essentially ignored the Palestinians, ignored their suffering, ignored the occupation, and on top of that, sought normalization deals between the Arab world and Israel that further cemented that we are now moving beyond the Palestinians, that at some point the Palestinians would return to violence. Because while the world may be forgetting about them, they had not forgotten about themselves, and they had to then assert their relevance. And unfortunately has manifested itself in this horrific attack earlier in October. And now we've seen even a greater death toll on the Palestinian side with all of the bombings of Israel, including the one in the hospital in Gaza, the Christian hospital.
Israel last fought Hamas only in 2021. How did we get to another war so quickly?
Well, the strategy of the Israelis has been called mowing the lawn, meaning that they maintain an occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, and every 1 or 2 years there will be some violence, and then the Israelis go on a bombing campaign and push back the Palestinians. And one Israeli security person that I spoke to earlier last week said that one of the key things that this attack has done is that it has made Israelis realize that their presumption that the cost of retaining, sustaining that occupation was acceptable, that it would never get particularly high and it would be manageable, something that Israel could absorb, has proven completely false, because that situation was much more dangerous. The Palestinians were not going to accept indefinitely living in this occupation. And Israel has now suffered tremendously itself as a result of that assumption.
One of the most interesting features of the Israeli diplomatic outreach in the wider region was how little Palestine and the Palestinian cause came up in conversations with the UAE, with Qatar, with the Saudis. What did you make of that while it was happening? And is what we're seeing now almost a result of that, part of the same story?
It is part of the same story. And I think this is all coming originally from the fact that during the Arab Spring, the Palestinian issue ceased to be the central issue that the Arab streets cared about, understandably, because now they had their own uprisings in their own countries and they were looking inwards. The error, however, was to assume that this was a new normal, that this was not a temporary phenomenon, but a permanent shift. And that has now proven to be completely false, because clearly, not only does the Arab world, the rest of the world cares about this very much, but it was wrong to rely on these Arab regimes, almost all of them undemocratic, almost all of them pursuing their own interest and not caring about the broader sentiments in their region, because many of them, in the case of UAE, hardly has a population. Most of the people who live there are expats. And then build a new US strategy based on these assumptions. This started under Trump with the Abraham Accord, which explicitly said we're moving beyond the Palestinian issue. And then the Biden administration pursued the same objective. They built on the Abraham Accord. They've been trying to outdo the Abraham Accord by getting Israel and Saudi Arabia to normalize, again, setting aside the Palestinians, again, ignoring their demands. The Palestinians, in part of those conversations, had demanded, for instance, the recognition of a Palestinian state. The Biden administration flat out rejected that demand.
What about Israel's calculation? We'll go through some of the players one by one, but what did you make of Israel's calculation? Did they really think that if they just stopped talking about it, that the Palestinian problem, the crisis, this 75-year, 100-year, 150-year story would be over?
Again, it sounds very odd given what has happened in the last week or so, but that is part of that calculation. The calculation was the occupation is problematic but manageable, that all of the technology and military superiority of the Israelis would lead to a situation in which every once in a while there would be an outburst of violence, but it would be manageable. Whatever the cost of it was, Israel could absorb, because no one envisioned that something like this could happen. So it's setting aside, the morality of the question. That's not what was being taken into account. What was taken into account is whether the amount of violence that would come from a permanent occupation was manageable or not. The assumption was yes. Reality is no.
Let's move on to Hamas, because they had some decisions to make as they were contemplating this action, as they were designing and planning it. When you are fighting, at least in your own mind, an adversary with many, many times the resources, the strength, the military organization, the willingness to use disproportionate response as a tactic, how do you get to a situation where you're putting hundreds of thousands of other people's lives on the line in your own interests as an organization?
We have to keep in mind that Hamas is not a democratic organization. Hamas came to power 15 or 16 years ago, but there's not been any elections being held in Gaza ever since to really be able to see where the Palestinian people stand on this issue. The Palestinians in general seem to be as disillusioned with their undemocratic leadership as many of the other Arab populations are with theirs, as well as populations elsewhere in the world. And the expectation that Hamas would follow the same type of calculations as we would like to see, perhaps, is one that we would have to revise. Hamas, from the very beginning of its foundation, has not been an organization that has renounced violence. They believe that violent resistance against Israel is their only path. They're looking at what is happening in the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority that has negotiated with Israel. And during this period, we've seen the Palestinians lose more and more territory. They look at that and justify in their own minds a violent struggle. Now, of course, one has to recognize, according to international law, populations under occupation are entitled to use violence to resist that occupation. In fact, I'm sure no one has ever asked a Ukrainian on American TV why Ukraine doesn't pursue a nonviolent resistance to Russia's occupation. That idea wouldn't even come into our mind. But it's important to recognize that even though violent resistance is permitted by international law, it does not mean that other parts of international law are no longer applying. They are still valid, which means that Hamas cannot commit war crimes. Hamas cannot go and kidnap children. Hamas cannot do most of the different things that they have done in their violent struggle. Those are also violations of international law. Many of them can be classified as war crimes. So Hamas is in that sense in no way a player that we should exempt from the very same demands. The problem I think we're having on the American side, I think it's very clear right now, we are extremely uneven in the manner in which we are applying international law, which then makes our credibility not where it should be when it comes to these issues.
Give me some examples. Flesh that point out further. How is the United States being selective in its imposition of these standards?
Israel is continuing to impose a blockade. They have themselves explicitly said that they're cutting off water, cutting off electricity. These are collective punishment measures. Those are not compatible with international law. When the Russians are using such methods in Ukraine, we rightfully condemn it. We have not condemned that when the Israelis are doing it. We're not seeing a lot of pressure on the Israelis to not do it. I think Biden's focus is perhaps mostly to make sure that the Israelis don't start a land invasion or that they limit the land invasion. And that's a worthy goal in my view. But we may not take note, the rest of the world does. They see an inconsistent approach by the United States. And that makes our leadership, our ability to be able to move matters towards a solution, less efficient because we're not seen as credible as we should be.
For its own part, the Israeli Defense Forces have, at least initially, maintained that it was an Islamic Jihad rocket launch that failed in reaching its target that hit the hospital in Gaza.
Sorry, you want me to comment on that?
Yeah, please.
I can't make a judgment except for seeing some of the videos that are already out on Twitter. And this does not in any way, shape, or form seem compatible with that account. Some of the time stamps on the videos that have been released by the Israelis also do not match the timing of the attack. It is very difficult to judge, however, but we have never seen a misfired Islamic Jihad or Hamas rocket cause this amount of damage. So I'm quite skeptical, and I think it's going to be a massive uphill battle for the Israelis to convince the world of this, unless they have some really, really strong evidence.
In 2023, does evidence even really matter? Given that there are discrete publics that will come away from an action like this convinced that their own side is indemnified, that it's definitely the other guys, when we have an information ecosystem where it's possible to just continue to reinforce your previously held beliefs around actions and their consequences, I don't know anymore if investigations and evidence and all the features of how we get to the bottom of things like this matter as much as they used to.
I think you're quite right that this is a significant problem. And I would go back to what I said earlier on. When it comes to this lack of confidence, with this suspiciousness, paranoia, conspiratorial theories, etc., it certainly doesn't help when there's also latent cases of inconsistency. I think the fact that there is so much mistrust is one thing that just means that we have to do everything we can to bolster our own credibility. And you do that through your actions and making sure that there's consistency and principles that are guiding our actions. I don't think that is where we are right now. So our ability to turn the tide of a very valid problem that you pointed to, we're not ready for it, I fear.
One party that we haven't yet talked about is Iran. its involvement, its motivations, its calculus in either aiding in or being aware of beforehand an attack like the one Hamas unleashed on Israel?
So far, we haven't seen any evidence, and both the United States and the Israelis have stated that they have no evidence of Iran's active involvement, meaning that they have been operationally involved. The United States has shared intelligence with some newspapers saying that the initial reactions of the Iranians was that they were surprised. That, however, does not change, I think, an undisputable fact that the Iranians have massively aided and helped arm and train Hamas. On that issue, I don't think there is any question. They've also provided it with money. And in the view of the Biden administration, that makes Iran at least indirectly complicit. It still is a different matter if a smoking gun evidence were to emerge that the Iranians actually had operational involvement. Because if that's the case, the Israelis will be able to make a compelling case that what happened with Hamas's attack is not just an Hamas attack, it is also an act of war from Iran. That would change the picture quite a lot in the current scenario. And that's why that distinction is an important one.
Including keeping the United States from continuing to pursue a re-entry of the JCPOA, which sought to limit, at least slow down, Iran's nuclear research?
Even short of that evidence, we're not seeing any appetite in the Biden administration, at least now, until the elections, for anything that would be able to revive that nuclear program. The agreement that was struck about 5-6 months ago and a quiet understanding between Iran and the United States has essentially been to try to keep matters both in the region, but it's not in terms of Gaza. In the region, it mainly means the Persian Gulf, and the nuclear front in such that neither side really escalates. But what has happened now means that there is no appetite whatsoever to explore any additional potential pathway to go back to the agreement. Depending on how things develop in the next couple of weeks and months, there may not be any appetite in Washington or in Tehran for a return to negotiations on the nuclear front, even after the US elections. And at some point, that is going to create a real and very dangerous crisis because the Iranian nuclear program continues to grow as we speak.
In an atmosphere as well of a tightening relationship with Moscow, right?
Certainly. Iran's relationship with Russia is much, much closer now than it was before. What the Iranians are doing in supporting Russia in Ukraine is something that has had a profound impact on European perspectives on Iran, in which the Europeans before tend to be a driving force to get the United States and Iran to resolve the nuclear issue. But that's because they saw the Iranian program as a problem, but war with Iran as a bigger problem. Now they see Iran supporting a country that they view as an existential threat, Russia. So the manner in which the Europeans have shifted their perspective on whether Iran does or does not constitute a real threat to them has been a significant change on that front. I would have to say, however, that I think that had Trump not pulled out of the JCPOA and had Biden gone back into the JCPOA right away, as he could have, through an executive order, instead of this dragged out negotiating process, hoping for a longer and stronger deal, which has led to nowhere, unfortunately, that I don't think that Iran would have been supporting Russia in Ukraine if the deal was still valid. And I can tell you, I've spoken to people in the Biden administration who share that perspective. Because if the deal was still in place and we were still in it, the Iranians would have something very significant to lose by supporting Russia. The more we have cut ourselves off from Iran, we also put them in a situation in which they have less to lose. And part of the consequence of that, one part of it, not entirely because of that, is a very, very problematic role that Iran currently is playing in Ukraine.
Does this also scupper the possibility of the détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
No, I think the Saudi-Iran normalization agreement is not threatened by this. in some ways, the Saudis have been actually forced to move closer to the Iranian position as a result of Hamas's attack and the Arab world's reaction to Israel's bombardment of Gaza. For the first time ever, MBS called Iran's president, Raisi, and had a 45-minute conversation in which they agreed on certain points, such as a ceasefire, an end to the violence, etc. That was an interesting move, not one that I think he would have done short of the current crisis, because MBS himself had been quite out there ignoring the Palestinian issue, wanting to move beyond it, and was in advanced negotiations with the United States and Israel for an Israeli-Saudi normalization deal. Then suddenly this thing happened in Gaza, and guess what? The Iranians are coming across as if they're helping the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, and Saudi Arabia was sidelined. I think that call he made was partly to prevent Iran from getting full ownership of the Palestinian cause, a cause that Saudi Arabia, at least under MBS, seemed to have been happy to abandon just 3 weeks ago.
So, therefore, also, this puts the overt and covert contacts between Saudi Arabia and Israel in a different light?
Yes, I think the idea of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia is definitely put on ice for now. I personally think that also the very premise of it has been destroyed. And that premise, again, was the idea that you can move beyond the Palestinians, that you can make a normalization deal without resolving the Palestinian issue. I doubt that the Saudis are going to be comfortable going back to that formula. If they go back to the table for a normalization deal with Israelis, I think MBS is going to be forced to dramatically increase his asks on the Palestinian question. And it's going to come at a time in which the Israelis most likely are going to have zero appetite for any compromise with the Palestinians, given what Hamas has done.
One of the Arab countries that has had normal relationships for a long time with Israel is Egypt, which for a long time saw itself as the natural leader of the Arab world, the most prominent state in that big crescent of land going all the way from Morocco to Baghdad. Where does this leave Egypt? It seems to have been caught flat-footed.
This is highly problematic for Egypt as well, of course, because Egypt has been a co-partner with Israel in the occupation of Gaza since they're controlling the Egyptian side of the border and are reinforcing the same measures of controlling what goes in and out. What the Egyptians are worried about right now, first of all, is the anger on the Egyptian street as to what is happening. Secondly, that if the bombardment continues and also leads to a land invasion, and the Israelis want 1.1 million Palestinians there to essentially relocate and go into the Sinai and go into Egypt, the Egyptians cannot absorb that number of people, given their own internal problems, massive economic issues, and the crisis that would bring about, including the fear that once the Palestinians have left Gaza in those large numbers, that they may not be able to return, similar to what happened earlier on when Israel was founded and many of the Palestinians fled and have been living lives as refugees ever since.
Wow. So this one attack, as bloody, as terrible, as merciless as it was 48 hours, 72 hours of military action. It seems to have totally rewritten the scenarios in that big part of the world. Is that fair?
It certainly has, but what I think it has done is that it has reasserted a reality that many in the region and certainly in Washington had either ignored or chosen to ignore, or as I explained earlier on, thought could be managed, and it cannot. And we're now returning into a point in which the Palestinian cause is going to be a very important one in the Arab world. The cost for Arab countries to work with the United States, absent some effort on the US side to actually impose restraints on Israel, are going to go up significantly.
Wow. So there are some decisions to be made at the State Department, in the Oval Office, in the United Nations. If you got a call from someone inside the White House, Trita, what should we do? What should the next couple of weeks look like? What would you tell them?
Well, first of all, I think it is absolutely essential for the United States to use the leverage that it has to make sure that we do get to a full ceasefire and the release of the hostages that Hamas is holding. That means no more bombardment by Hamas of Israel, release of those hostages, as well as an end to the bombardment of Gaza by the Israelis. No more killing. That also means preventing a land invasion. And the reason why that is so essential is not just because of a very large number of people that will be killed on the Israeli side, as well as, of course, the Palestinian side, but also because a land invasion very likely will trigger a regional war in which Hezbollah will attack Israel from the north. There may be attacks by the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, on Israel from Syria. And such an involvement by Iran and Hezbollah into the war is very likely going to put massive pressure on the United States to intervene in this conflict militarily. And then suddenly, we're not just stuck with a horrible conflict in Ukraine, a potential conflict with China over Taiwan, but also yet another war in the Middle East. This is not something that the United States can afford, nor does it serve its interest. So as bad as the situation is right now, and it is bad, unfortunately, it may very soon get much, much worse. And I would say as a first priority, the United States should do everything it can to make sure that it doesn't go in that direction. And that means not freezing things where they are, but actually de-escalating the conflict right now.
If you take a nihilist attitude toward this, you may be someone who's been trying to solve this some other way, but now you're desperate, your life is getting worse, you feel perhaps hopeless. Is drawing the United States into the conflict, even if it means a tremendous visiting of force, even if it means unleashing death, civilian death on your own people, are there people willing to make that argument that this is a worthwhile calculation to make?
I don't think that that's the calculation that will be made. I think the calculation on the end of Hezbollah, for instance, is more that if Israel goes in with land forces into Gaza, not only will there be a tremendous amount of suffering that will put pressure on many Arab parties to intervene, but also if Israel is relatively successful and manages to decimate Hamas, that frees up Israel to focus far more on Hezbollah. Israel has mobilized 350,000 people. I spoke to some Israelis earlier this week who said that there are voices within the Israeli security establishment that says, now when 350,000 people have been mobilized, why not go into war in Lebanon? So the Lebanese Hezbollah is going to assume the worst. They're going to assume that they are next if Israel succeeds. And as a result, may choose to intervene, not to save Hamas, but to save themselves by making the war as costly as possible for Israel in order to prevent Israel to later on go and attack and take out Hezbollah without having to deal with the situation in Gaza. Iran's calculation may be quite similar to that. The issue is that we're getting closer to points in which many of the actors may think that a preemptive attack is preferable than to wait for the war to come to you, since they increasingly will think that that is an inevitability. And that's why a de-escalation right now is so crucial, not just for the stability in the region, but also for U.S. interests. Because again, the last thing the United States needs is another war in the Middle East.
Trita Parsi, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground. Great to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.